On another topic, security, we meet as the Obama administration is defending having secured FISA court requests from internet corporations to essentially seize not only telephone records, but email records. We don't even know what they'd seize. They say it was important for fighting terrorism.
Well, if we had anything like a free press, there would be headlines saying this is a bad joke. The Obama administration is dedicated to increasing terrorism. In fact, it's doing it all over the world. Obama's running first of all, he's running the biggest terrorist operation that exists, maybe in history, the drone assassination campaigns, which are just part of it. There's special forces operations and so on. All of these operations are terror operations.
Why?
Well, suppose that you're walking down the street and you don't know whether 2 minutes from now the guy across the street and everything around him is going to be blown away by a sudden explosion run by somebody a couple of thousand miles away. You're terrorized. And in fact, villages, regions, countries are terrorized by these operations. And that has a reaction. People just don't say, fine, I don't mind if my cousin was murdered. They do mind. And they become what we call terrorists. This is completely understood from the highest level that as you carry out these operations, you're generating terrorism. First of all, they are terrorist operations, and they're generating more terrorist operations. Sometimes it's almost surreal. Like, take the marathon bombing. That's supposed to be the excuse for a lot of this stuff. A couple of days after the marathon bombings in Boston, there was a drone strike in Yemen. Usually we don't know anything about these things, but this one happens to be known because there was a young man from the village that was attacked who was in the United States, and by fortunate accident he was testifying before a Senate committee. And he described what happened in his village. He said for years the jihadi groups in Yemen had been trying to get the villagers to be anti-American, and they'd failed because the only thing they knew about America was what he was telling them, and he kind of liked it here. He was having a good time. So they're very pro-American. He said one drone attack turned them all into fanatic anti-American, what we call anti-Americans, people who hate the country that's just terrorizing them. Not surprised. That's just consider the way we react to acts of terror. Yeah, that's the way other people react to acts of terror. And the Osama bin Laden case is quite dramatic. And for one thing, as we talked about, it almost led to a nuclear war. The way they tracked bin Laden was by a fake vaccination campaign. The U.S. CIA was carrying out a pretended vaccination campaign in a town, Abbottabad, where they thought he was, in poor areas. That's a violation of principles that go back to the Hippocratic Oath. In the middle, they stopped it, which is another grotesque violation because they thought they'd found him somewhere else. Well, there's a lot of, throughout much of the Third World, there's a lot of fear and concern when rich white people come around and start sticking things into your arm. And what are they up to? You know, sensible fear. Actually, they have a history after all. Okay, this showed that the fear was correct. One of the consequences right away was that attacks on, there is a polio vaccination campaign underway in Pakistan. It's one of the last places in the world that has polio. It could be eradicated if it weren't for this kind of thing. There were attacks on polio vaccination workers. By now the charges are credible that these rich white guys are just trying to gather intelligence and undermine you and maybe send more drones to attack you. It was so severe that the UN had to pull out their vaccination teams. There are some estimates. One epidemiologist at Columbia, Les Roberts, has worked on these things, estimated that it may lead to maybe 100,000 polio cases in Pakistan. And he made an interesting comment. He said, one of these days, somebody in Pakistan is going to point to this child sitting in a wheelchair and say, you did it to him, and they'll react. So we're generating more of what we call terrorists. Meanwhile, in the course of this terrorist generation campaign, for Obama to claim, I'm really worried about terrorists,